XDR, Extended Detection and Response, is really the natural evolution of EDR, so endpoint detection and response, right? So endpoint detection and response being that key piece where we're gathering high fidelity data, process level data from the endpoint, reporting that into a central management platform backend, and ultimately giving visibility into the data within your organization, right? To understand, are there things like indicators of compromise, indicators of attack, and really, start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So EDR will give you things like visibility, root cause, and understand every process that's been touched, within a threat or an incident. So what XDR is doing beyond that is taking other pieces of the stack. So as we start to think about things like network security, NDR, email security, identity, all of those key pieces, and ingesting them as a data source. So we're not going to say from SentinelOne you need to get this, that, and the other from us, but we're working with best-of-breed tools to ingest those data sources into our platform, into our essentially data lake backend, and start to wrap automation around them, much as we do in the EDR space, to give essentially better outcomes across the stack, though, rather than focusing just on the endpoint. So what we're going to be talking about today, then, with regard to XDR, that extended detection and response, is this a legitimate security upgrade, right, or improvement, or is this just another buzzword? So with that in mind, then, let's get into things and understand, well, where does the need for this really come from? What have we seen, historically within the cybersecurity space? Well, starting from the bottom there, typically resources in this case alludes to both technology and people. What we've seen is that they really don't scale in the way that these threats do these days, and that's largely because of things like automation on the bad actors side, right? If we think about things like ransomware, they can be they can propagate endlessly, right, in terms of getting them out there and infecting systems, and a lot of that, as I said, on the attacker side is now automated these days. So we can't just keep buying more tools or employing more people, as it doesn't scale effectively. And as you can see there, that leads to the effectiveness of our cybersecurity function over time decreasing, as it were. Now, some of the facts across the top there you can see to back this up, right? So very, very large cybersecurity spend annually, as we know. But despite that, we've still got this 162-day dwell time, right? So far, far too long for someone to be inside our network, be able to carry out essentially malicious activity. And that's all compounded by digital transformation, which I'm sure at this point now, in a, I want to say post-COVID world, hopefully, but even at this point, where that natural perimeter, right, so where our users are working from is, of course, spread out massively. They're not all in the corporate office anymore. They might be working from home or elsewhere. And the problem that this brings as well is, additional attack vectors too. So that kind of compounds the problem in that sense. So just understanding, where we've been before this then, just very, very quickly in terms of the history of cybersecurity. Again, I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with this, whether it be on the far left-hand side there with kind of the original malicious attacks, right? In terms of those I love you emails, which, of course, people at that point weren't very, very aware of phishing-style attacks. So, yeah, it all kind of started there in the mid-1990s, and that birthed what we know as antivirus, right, AV, so we think about McAfee and all the people in those space, essentially looking at a file when it lands, checking the hash and saying, is that on a bad list? It is. Great, because then we can essentially do something about it. But as we moved on in time, attacks started to get a little bit more in-depth, right, and using additional techniques. So we saw some of this with the TJ Maxx attacks back in 2005, 2007, so harvesting data of their customers. And that only continued as we moved into more towards the present day, right? So we saw again the largest cybersecurity attack in the world at the time was the attack on Target's point of sale system. So again, not something that had necessarily been considered before that point as an attack vector. And then again, only continued into 2017, 2018, and we've seen more breaches on the customer data side now. So if you think about Facebook in 2018. 87 million users data compromised. So we can see that this problem has compounded over time. And how we've traditionally responded to those, first and foremost, was in a reactive way. Again, as I mentioned with the antivirus, we can only see something when it lands on the device. We can check if that's essentially bad, and if it is, we can do something about it, which was fine at the time, worked very well. But again, back then there were, and some of these things are absolutely still being used today, but spam filters will help with that as well, password protections, everything that you see there. But as we came to look at more of these advanced attacks, which are utilising some of those more interesting techniques, right, beyond just a malicious file on the endpoint, really it started to move towards this proactive approach, right, where, okay, nowadays a lot of businesses are employing threat hunters as part of the security operations centre to go out and proactively hunt through the data to see if there are any interesting points in there that they could potentially build a threat hunt off of. And in addition to this, thinking about the proactive approach, or what has been, a lot more awareness, I'd say, generally now, whether it be, absolutely in the security team primarily, but in terms of our users. So we're never going to be perfect in this area, right? Again, going back to the idea of phishing, someone's always going to click something interesting. But now we've got things like proactive network and endpoint monitoring as well. So again, what can we do ahead of time to make these devices secure as possible, and everything that alludes to the risks there for the business as well. Cool. So framing the problem nowadays then, I think it's a nice place to start just with some kind of third-party validation around what it is that we're looking at. So you can see SANS in 2020 there really broke down what is an incident or threat management into kind of three key stages. And every organisation exists within one of these three stages, right? Whether it be pre-incident, so understanding what can we do to minimise risk, right? Give ourselves the best chances of essentially preventing something and not allowing ourselves to be compromised. You've got post-incident as well, so after the event, right? What have we learned? What can we do? Is there anything we can put in place going forward that is going to prevent that from happening again as well? But what we're really going to focus on here then is the incident itself. So that limited time frame in which you've identified a threat and you've done everything, taken all the necessary steps that you can in order to contain, respond, clean up and recover. And now, at this point, in today's landscape, there's a heavy focus on the user side with regard to who's using the security platform, right? If it's an analyst, this is going to be very, very manual in terms of maybe gathering data points from various areas, whether it be, again, on the identity side, on the endpoint side, or the network side, wherever that information is coming from. And this is the part that we're really trying to reduce and make it a lot quicker in terms of time to respond. So again, we can further break this down in terms of that peri-incident timeline itself. So if we just build this one out, again, what I mentioned about many steps within the containment of that threat itself, right? You can see we break this down into detect, response, and identify, investigate, and so on. But what's important here again is just the amount of time it can take for an analyst to use several tools, understand, okay, well, we've got an indicator of compromise here. Is it related to something that's going on over here, as well as we've seen on the network? If it is, then great. But still, it's going to take manual steps to investigate that. It's going to take time. And ultimately, what we're trying to address with the XDR piece is the reduction of that time, right? And building automation into responses. What we do today in terms of the endpoint, absolutely, but across the wider stack as well. Cool. So again, just a little bit of third-party validation in terms of the direction that we're going here. You can see that Forrester really talked about EDR being the next kind of step. XDR being the next kind of step in terms of where security is going. And I think a lot of the feedback we've had, to be candid up to this point, is that people are saying, hey, I might be doing this already with my SIM and my SOAR tool. And we'll go on to explain where the real differences lie between our approach and what's being done already today. But yeah, in terms of where it's coming from, I think XDR, or this buzzword as it is, has been around for maybe 2 or 3 years already. So it's taken a little bit of time to kind of find its place. But no, very, very valid in terms of bringing again all that data together and understanding, well, how can we get the most out of the tools that we've already got? They should be speaking to each other. We don't want to have information silos between these tools as well. The more we can integrate, the more we can connect those, the better chance we have of actually finding the problem, but more importantly, doing something about it. And so I mentioned this just now, but XDR is not SIM, right? So it's not essentially log correlation. Really, a lot of these SIM tools, they weren't born as a security product in the first place, right? They were just essentially a log ingestion, and of course there are security elements to them now. But as we know, as you scale as a business, that can get very, very expensive. It can be very, very hands-on, and essentially there are a lot of false positives within that information as well. And as we start to think about SOAR, so security, orchestration and remediation, again, you can do a lot, or many of the things that we're doing with XDR with that. However, the key difference here is, if we think about SOAR, then that's, again, very, very manual, right? Playbooks have to be written. If the person that wrote that playbook leaves the business, then who looks after that and who maintains that? And the same on the product side. If there's a version change that has big changes as part of that, what impact does that have on the playbook, right? Do you have to rewrite anything at code level? That can get very, very complex, be very, very time consuming, and as I said, it doesn't really scale well with for the business. So really the key thing here as well is that scale, right? We believe that we should be able to offer XDR and really use those key pieces that people have already got in place in terms of their security stack. But we should be able to offer that across, regardless of the size of the business, to be able to give automated reaction but in a much more simplified fashion. So if we think about SOAR again, that could be at code level and writing very complex integrations. Very much the approach that we take and what we've got today is more of a kind of central console. So again, a single place to log in. You wouldn't even have to log into many of those additional tools in your stack. Have that as your central management plane. So I know it gets used a lot, but single pane of glass. So use that as a central point, and then have things like radio buttons in there with regards to the integrations, the XDR integrations, saying, what do we want to do if we see X? So as a very, very quick example for that then, where an XDR would help is if we saw, let's say, a phishing email landed on an endpoint, of course, SentinelOne's going to pick that up with regards to any malicious attachment itself. But maybe an automated XDR action off the back of that is to force the user to re-authenticate an Okta or suspend their session. Maybe it is to change their permissions in Mimecast as well, right, with regards to what they can access in their emails. So you can see there's kind of additional steps that we can take to secure the organisation further, but they shouldn't have to be hands-on every single time. They should be very much automated, which is that key piece of XDR. And so what will that lead us to? Where are we going with this? Well, as I said, more threats these days, more data, more security tools. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to handle more threats, right? Again, as we think about that, that exponential growth of threats and everything that comes with that. So in order to achieve a better outcome, essentially we have to look to XDR. And just in terms of SentinelOne's journey and how we got to this point as well, if we start with the bottom left there, you can see for us it began with what we call NGAV, so next gen antivirus. So looking at, absolutely known malware, but also unknown malware and those zero-day attacks as well. That was very much our bread and butter and entry point into the market. And as you can see there, or it might be a little bit low for some of you, but this is really to focus on a reduction of impact on the device, right? So at this point in time, a lot of the problems in the marketplace were heavy agents on devices, right? So it's great to be protected, but you shouldn't have to have that question of productivity versus security, right? You shouldn't slow your users down, and that was very much our focus at that point. So the approach that we took to that, by the way, you can see autonomous AV prevention, and we still do this today, by the way. But we look at process data in real time, right, at machine speed, and essentially we have a running confidence score to say, does this look suspicious, malicious, or is it simply benign? And we're doing that in real time. So again, we don't have to send things back to the cloud, but we have, AI machine learning built into the agent itself to understand, is there anything interesting here? And if there is, of course, take action off the back of that. But as I said, that was very much focusing on the device itself. The next kind of evolution of that naturally led to EDR, which we talked about a little bit at the start there, so endpoint detection and response. But really, this is to get that full visibility into what's going on. So absolutely to get the visibility, but also to give you the platform to take response action, right? Whether that be something like quarantining your file, whether that be looking at all the changes that have been made as part of that threat and undoing or deleting them, or it could even be essentially something that's unique to us at SentinelOne, which is the ability to roll back a device as well to a state of pre-infection. We often get asked, well, how do you do that? And essentially, it's using Windows shadow copies to leverage a point before a machine was infected, referencing that and rolling it back to a step-free infection. So pretty cool functionality, and quite unique to us as well. But that was the next progression, and at that point in time, it was really focused around the incident itself, right? So drilling into the incident, where did it come in from? How can we improve going forward? How can we harden systems, or essentially stop this from happening again? And now where we've arrived at, as I said, is XDR. So this is, again, the next kind of natural evolution here. And we're looking to essentially shift the focus to the outcome now. So what is the outcome for the business? And build that business resilience in terms of understanding everything that's affecting our organisation from multiple data points, having a central platform to control that, and building responses off the back of that as well. And when you have a central platform that's speaking to a bunch of different tools, what that means is there's less chance for misconfiguration, there's less training for those teams, there's less consoles to log into, and in some sense as well, there's less agents on the devices that you're looking to protect. Cool. So just a little bit more around the EDR piece then, and how do we really achieve that? Because I think it sets the scene nicely for how we put the automation behind XDR as well. So essentially, we use a technology that we call storylines. And what we see on each device, whether that be an endpoint, as in a workstation or a server, a mobile device, a cloud workload, whatever that may be, there's obviously lots of different processes unfolding on each of those all the time, every day. And so what we do, as I said, is track that in real time, right? So understand all of that process data, start to see what process invoked the next. Is that an expected behaviour? So using detection around that as well, beyond AI, also looking at behaviours. So we do a lot with MITRE, for example, which we'll come on to talk about a little bit later. But yeah, tracking everything at the process level to understand what's it speaking to. What are all of the events within a process as well, so the actions that are being taken. And what that allows us to do is really identify, as soon as something turns bad. And then because we can identify as soon as something turns bad, we can block it, again, in real time to stop all of the bad stuff thereafter happening, right? And again, because we've seen that all the way through, we can understand, well, where did it get into the organisation, right? Is there some patching you need to do? Or perhaps, as with some more recent attacks, is somebody being, socially engineered for their credentials, for example. Where does that come from, and what can we do about, changing that in the future? And then again, as I said, with that rollback technology as well, we can essentially, remove that. So that's not just limited to rollback as well, but we can remediate without actually rolling back the device. So we can understand, or we can essentially surgically remove all of the malicious activity from that wider story, I suppose. So again, going back to the idea of allowing your users to continue working and not interfering with them, right, in terms of their day-to-day objective. Cool. All right then. So again, a little bit of third-party validation. This is largely around the EDR part as well. So some of you may be familiar with MITRE, but essentially MITRE is a framework as well as a third-party evaluator. And every year they invite all vendors in the EDR space to come and test. You can see at the top left there, 2 days of emulating advanced persistent threat testing, and in that there was 109 sub-steps. Now I always get a little bit nervous when we're talking around 100% protection, because I don't think that's, it's always a little bit dangerous to paint that on yourself, isn't it? In terms of we stop everything all the time, so I'd never say that. But in this case, we certainly did, right? So we detected every step, 109 sub-steps within that attack. But I think what's not mentioned on this slide, which is probably the more important part, is of those 109 sub-steps, we produced just 7 alerts. So again, that ties back to the storylines technology, right? In terms of, look, our analysts shouldn't have to go and jump about the place, understand, well, is this connected to that? What's the relationship between those? We consolidate it all into storylines, in this case, 7 storyline alerts. And yeah, fill those with contextualized information, link that into MITRE in terms of the tactics, techniques and procedures that we're seeing being used, so they're presented within the console as well. So producing just 7 alerts, and I think the next closest to that was around 50 plus or so. So again, it just speaks to making that as easy as possible for your security team, but still giving the information that they require. And that's been the way. By the way, we've performed pretty well over the last 3 years, so very consistent in this space as well. And just as important is that 0 delays on the right-hand side. So again, this part goes back to what I was saying about doing things at machine speed in real time. So not having to send information back up to the cloud and doing the analytics side in the cloud, but doing that at the agent level, at the device level in real time. So what does the platform look like as a whole then with regard to this XDR vision? Well, starting on the left-hand side there, you can see all of the ingestion that we're able to do. The ones at the top left in purple are things that SentinelOne are already doing already, pardon me. So yeah, gathering data from endpoints, server workloads, mobile, all of those good things. And then down the bottom left-hand side, you see some of the integrations that we've got that exist today through the open marketplace. So many of them have pre-built applications as well. But the idea here is to make it as easy as possible to plug in those additional tools, to get them feeding data into the central platform and giving you the basis to take response actions on that, as you see on the right-hand side. So some of those I mentioned before, the rollback, which is very powerful. And a lot of people say to me, Ross, have you even seen ransomware before? The first thing it will do is try and target those volume shadow copies. Well, we actually protect those shadow copies much in the way that we do tamper prevention around the agent itself, so that they can't be destroyed or modified or anything like that. So yeah, the rollback functionality is very, very powerful. But then you've got some of those additional response actions with regard to XDR, right? So I mentioned maybe changing email permissions, maybe forcing authentication again on the identity side, or even quarantining files for the things like later inspection or for sandboxing as well. Some things that we can also do today within the SentinelOne platform is things like remote script execution. And so again, this could probably help in some form with incident response, right? So doing things like data collection or artifact collection as it relates to incident response. Essentially just deploying scripts from a central place, but again, this can give just another string to the bow in terms of response actions that you can take. And then anything that comes off the back of a third-party tool as well. But essentially, this is the overall view of the platform. The key piece in the middle there is where we're doing a lot of that automation, right? And you can see some of those T numbers there. They are the MITRE T numbers, right? So what specific technique is being used, correlating that data and presenting that in a way that makes sense for our customers. Now, what does that look like within the console itself? Just to give you a bit of a preview, unfortunately, we're not able to do a full demo today. So what's going on here? Well, this is an alert that's been essentially resolved or remediated, should I say. A few things to look at here. So about halfway down the screen there, you've got information on the threat itself, right? So where did it come from? What's the user context? What's the hash of the file if that's valid? You've also got that storyline ID, which I'm not sure if you can see just here. And essentially, what that does is give you a central point to click into to understand, again, every event that was tied to that at that really granular level, right? To understand, well, things like scheduled task creation, registry key creation, modification, and of course, file writes, reads, whatever it may be. But more importantly, on the right-hand side, as it alludes to XDR then, what you can see there is some log ingestion from Microsoft AD, from Ativa, and from Mimecast. So understand, or getting that information to understand, well, what are these other tools saying about that? Have we seen anything within those other tools specific to this or that? And if we have identified other things within those tools, it's going to be presented here within this dashboard as well. And just to give you a little bit of a look then into what are the actions that you can take. Some of these I mentioned already, but this is how it's presented within the console. So in this case, we are looking at it in the context of an alert, right? So when I go in to take some action off the back of an alert, what do I want to do, right? What do I want to do across any of those integrations, Zscaler, Mimecast, and of course we've got loads more that we can integrate with as well. But in this case, what we're doing here is a very much manual reaction, right? So to say, well, we should, in real time, suspend this user. But again, a lot of what's going to be done here, or that is available today as well, is building this into policy, right? So you can say, again, when we see X, what do we want Mimecast to do? So, when we see a malicious file, what action should be taken by this tool? What action should be taken by that tool? So very much to simplify that overall process and build that automation into XDR that we're already doing in EDR today as well. And what we'll find there with the outcome then is, as you may expect, right, that reduced dwell time is really the key one there. But it allows us to scale our people and our tools against the threats much more effectively. And that's because they're all speaking to each other and we get a much more context-rich approach to threat management. You can see there at the top as well, zero ransomware impact, which is always, again, a little bit of an interesting one to say, but again, it's something that we feel that we've done or been very effective in preventing, right? Both in the recognition of the ransomware or the detection of the ransomware in the first place, but then giving you the possibility to do something about it should something leak through. So just to put that in a real world scenario, right? What we can effectively do is, if the organisation is impacted by ransomware, you've got a bunch of encrypted files. There's no reason that you couldn't again use that rollback functionality to restore to a point of essentially pre-infection, and in that case, those files would no longer be encrypted. And so, essentially, you don't have the problem there anymore, and that's absolutely being used today in real world scenario. Cool. So I think that was all I had to cover from my side. Hopefully, that gives you a view into XDR and what we're doing here at SentinelOne and our approach to things. I think hopefully I've got the timings. Yeah. All right. Good stuff. Any questions that I could take from you guys? Yeah.
Obviously, pulling in a whole pile of different information from endpoints.
Yes.
Obviously, pulling in a whole pile of endpoints. Not that like small room. Yeah, that's fine. You're pulling in all this information.
Yep.
Is the product also doing kind of vulnerability detection recommendations as well? You surely have information.
Yeah. Great question, and you sure you haven't teed me up for that one, because we are indeed doing that. So with SentinelOne, when you install the agent itself, what you're going to get is an application inventory across wherever you've installed. And as part of that, we do CVSS scoring on those applications, right, to say, are there any vulnerabilities, serve you up the patch that you need to apply if there are. Now, at this point in time, it is vulnerability assessments, so providing just review of what's the risk to the organisation and prioritisation around that. But interestingly enough, what we're doing, I think it's early next year actually, and it's in development right now, is the patching of those applications as well. So that'll be pretty compelling at that point, right, to have AV, EDR, patch management as well, and there's even some things we can do with regards to rogue system detection, all delivered from a single agent as well. So to answer your question, yes. Thank you. Yeah, please.
What are some of the key security tools that you recommend integrating if you're doing a version to the EDR? Which ones to look for?
Yeah, it's always a little bit of a tricky one. There are some that we've just seen in terms of popularity, right, that just get brought to us. So if we think of on the SIM side, it's always going to be, people integrate a lot with Splunk, QRadar, Logarithm, they're really the key ones. We don't really try and say, what should we look at next, but allow our customers to drive that need for it, right? So I'd just say in terms of best of breed tools, absolutely, if you look in respective areas, then yeah, usually we can integrate with it. If it's not officially supported at that point, then things can still be done. But in terms of recommendation, what we find is that it's not advisable for us to go into a customer and say, hey, you need to swap this to that to achieve this. What we want to be able to do is say, hey, we can integrate your existing tools, hopefully regardless of what they are, and use them as a data source, but have this as a central management point for all those data sources. Hopefully that answers your question to some degree. Okay, thank you.
Ah,
Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.